Firstly, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Chris Fry from the NAB's Agribusiness Financial Planning area, but more importantly, thank you for taking the time to come today. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Wurundjeri people, part of the Kunon Nation, on which their country is that we meet here today. Also want to pay my respects to the past and present elders. It's important that we acknowledge for most of us in this room, have only been in this country for a short period of time, and there's been a history of Indigenous people before us. In fact, if we look at the history of this country and the land around this area, it's documented over 40,000 years of human activity in this area. So that's 40,000 years of a culture facing the challenge of food security and how to meet the needs of its people. And if we then look for the last 200 years, we've had a European agricultural system in this country trying to meet those same challenges for a vibrant community. If we then look over a 12-month period, so we condense the 40,000 years of Indigenous history here in food security and 200 years of European history for food security and condense it in over 365 days. That's represented from the agriculture and the food security that we know at the moment by the European framework of a period of time from yesterday's breakfast until lunch today. It just puts it into some context. With regards to another vibrant and ancient culture, the ancient Greeks wrote a great deal of depth and gave it a lot of thought that there were three elements to have a human body, a human mind and a soul was important. So they were very much into the soul, the mind and the body. And today's event is really capturing those three aspects. We're going to be nourished and fed through the brain, through some thought leadership of our four experts here today. The other thing I just want to touch on, can I have a show of hands? How many people in the last 48 hours have had in some way a drink of milk? Thank you. 100%. Something as basic as a drink of milk. When I was younger, not too long ago, milk came in bottles and had cream on the top and was actually delivered to my door by a horse. Then we had homogenised, pasteurised. You go into the supermarkets today and there's low fat, high iron, low iron, milk for women, milk for blokes, milk for babies. And sometime about 10 years ago, my wife decided that I needed to have soya milk. So all I've drunk for 10 years is soya milk. And I'm told I have to buy organic beans from Australian producers. Does any of that actually matter? I don't know. But we're going to find out a bit today. Does it matter if we just look at our dairy industry, that some of the major producers of milk products in this country are Australian owned and are world exporters? Some are owned by Asian interests and some are owned by our New Zealand colleagues. Does any of that matter? I don't know. But I'd like to invite you all to recognise and thank four experts in this field that are going to nourish our mind. David, that includes yourself. We've got Kirsten, we have David, we have Chris and we have Russell. Kirsten Larsen, Policy and Research Manager from the Victorian Eco Lab as part of Melbourne University. So thank you, Kirsten. Kirsten's going to be talking around setting the scene for the food bowl in Victoria. David Cornish is the General Manager of the Meredith Dairies, an international exporter and a leading Australian award-winning sheep and cheese manufacturer. Chris Innes, Farm Manager of Ceres Community Farms, and Chris, my three daughters have been through your fine establishment over the years, so thank you. And finally, Russell Shields. Russell's the Food Program Coordinator for Second Bite, and if I can just acknowledge, Russell, on Friday I understand you won a Prime Minister's Environmental Award, the Banksy Award for community grants, so congratulations there as well. So without further ado, Kirsten, can I invite you for the next 10 minutes to share your thoughts and provide some nourishment of the brain?
Just a little bit of background. I work for an organisation called the Victorian Eco Innovation Lab, which is based at Melbourne University, but as a partnership with RMIT, Swinburne and Monash University. We were established by the state government about 4 years ago through the Environmental Sustainability Action Statement. And basically the objective of our organisation is to challenge about what a sustainable future might look like that's much more beyond an incremental change or small changes to the way that we currently do things. So we work with quite a lot of design students, landscape architecture students, industrial design, etc., around visualising some of those images, particularly for cities. But the part of the work that I run is around how we actually translate what is possible and what innovations are out there into what policy decisions we're making now. So it's about kind of reframing what the policy options are for government based on the size of the challenge, understanding the size of the challenges that we have and what the options might be available to us. So the first area of work that we picked up in that about 3 years ago was around food, because in the sustainability policy debate at the time there was very little discussion around what are the sustainability impacts of food if we're telling people to change light bulbs and change shower roses, etc. Where is food in this picture? Should we be telling people to eat organic, local food or not? Is there evidence around that? So that's basically where our journey started, was to try and map out what is the evidence base for the advice that you might give through policy or just generally in community. Since that time, we released a report in early 2008. This issue has just exploded into public consciousness globally and in Australia and in Victoria. So we've had a whole series of projects come out of that, and basically I haven't worked on anything other than food for about 3 years, which wasn't the intention, but that's okay because now I'm completely obsessed and can talk about it for hours. All right, so what I thought I would do in terms of 10 minutes as a bit of scene setting is talk a little bit about food security and how food security is being talked about and what does it mean. And one of the best breakdowns of this that I've seen comes from some European work which talks about food security in terms of availability, access and utilisation of food. So availability of food is about the physical amount, whether it's actually there, either produced in Victoria, Australia, or through imports, to meet the requirements of the population. We're doing quite a lot of work around this at the moment, including some physical modelling of which circumstances would make it difficult to actually meet the nutritional requirements of the Victorian or Australian populations, looking at different projections around land use, water availability, fertiliser efficiencies, fertiliser availabilities, etc. Some of the key issues around this are that, yes, Australia does export much more food than we eat, but that all foods are not created equal. So we are exporting a lot of beef and a lot of dairy, particularly from Victoria, and a lot of grains most of the time, but we are now importing more fruit and vegetables than we are exporting. Obviously, fruit and vegetables is critical to a healthy diet. We have also been a net wheat importer in 2 years in the last decade, which is pretty surprising to most people, but a lot of this is obviously to do with rainfall and seasonal availability of water. Some of the issues around this is that there is actually enough food on the planet for everybody now, and just having food availability doesn't mean that everybody has access to the food. So this occurs both at a global scale and locally in Victoria and in Australia. Globally, about half of the grain that we produce is now fed to animals or wasted through the food supply chain. So only about 43% of the cereal grain produced in the world is actually accessible or eaten by people. So there are big issues around that in terms of if we're talking about global food security, how do we feed 9 billion people, all the rest of it? We do have to start asking ourselves about, look, how do we make the choices about where food goes? Do we make the assumption that we need to double food production and that everybody's meat and dairy consumption will increase to the levels that we see in developed countries? Or do we sort of start to question whether that is actually sustainable? Is it possible? What are the implications for greenhouse gas emissions if we were to follow that path? Also, what are the implications for nutrition? There is a concept called the nutrition transition, which is basically where a country starts to develop and their key nutritional issues move from not having enough food, malnutrition, to having too much of the wrong foods, obesity, diabetes, inadequate fruit and vegetable intake, etc. So some of cancer and cardiovascular disease in Victoria and Australia account for about 39% of our disease burden. And the major risk factors for those are inadequate fruit and vegetable consumption, excess fat consumption, excess salt, excess sugar. So just kind of doubling food production, increasing the amount of these commodities doesn't actually help us to deal with the challenges around nutrition and what people are eating. It's also about the affordability of these different foods. Just producing more doesn't necessarily, and having them cheaper doesn't necessarily provide the incentives for people to eat the right foods. We have major disparities between sort of middle and upper income communities in, say, Australia. Obesity is much higher in low socioeconomic groups. Food security in Victoria, about 6% of households already report that they run out of food and haven't been able to afford to buy more. This food stress, food insecurity, dramatically increases your chances of being obese or having diabetes as well. Of course, there's lots of factors going on in here. It's not just about the price of food. It's about the price of oil that it takes to get the food. It's about how far you have to travel. It's about whether your fast food outlets are much more accessible to you than fruit and vegetable outlets. So there's a lot of complex factors that affect how people access food economically and physically. And those are major issues in Victoria, Australia and internationally. As we sort of talked a bit about before in terms of availability and global food availability, similarly in developing countries like India, Pakistan, lots of places, there is still a surplus of food produced, but the distribution channels are really problematic and the access for people who don't have any money to that food is more of a problem necessarily than some of the food production totals themselves. Let's see what else I was going to say. I might just talk a little bit on that topic as well in terms of emergency food relief, which obviously Russell will talk about more. Just check how I'm going for time. Is that there's been major increase in demand for emergency food relief across Victoria in the last couple of years. Some of the stats that I've been using from between 2006 and 2008, so prior to the global financial crisis. And one of the things that's particularly interesting is the big increase in demand in rural and regional Australia. And people are starting to report that drought relief was a big part of the factor in people actually requiring emergency food supplies. So levels of debt and stress in rural communities in Australia as a result of drought, increasing oil costs and input costs. In terms of trade, market access, there are a lot of issues for Australian farmers in terms of remaining viable and being able to continue producing. I won't talk any more about food waste because I think that Russell is probably going to do that, but I'll just run through a couple more quick statistics. So food production, distribution, etc. accounts for about 28% of an Australian household's greenhouse gas emissions. So as I mentioned before, changing light bulbs is good. Considering what we eat and what the greenhouse implications of that are is critical if we're actually going to deal with the challenge of climate change. There are urgent requirements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and some of these systemic issues as they run through food supply chains are complex, and it's hard to work out exactly what the best things are going to be to do. So there's a lot of argument around, is local food actually better in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? Of course, it varies on different foods and types, but it is going to make a difference if you can eliminate transport emissions, particularly if you're eliminating if you're focusing on seasonal foods that are produced nearby, you can reduce emissions. Also, the proportion of meat and dairy in the diet. I'm certainly not advocating vegetarian diets. I like cheese a lot. Vegan would be well and truly out of the ballpark for me. But there are issues around also processing, packaging, etc., that can make a difference to greenhouse gas emissions, as well as sustainable land management. And there's some incredible innovation going on across Australian landscapes in terms of vegetation and soil carbon sequestration and changes to the way that livestock and vegetation are managed that can have major benefits for sequestration and energy production, etc. Also, as far as water use goes, about 50% of an Australian household's water use is in their food compared to 11% directly used, and that 11% includes garden use, etc. So similarly, changing the diet and the amount of water used in the production of your diet will have a much more significant impact than changing your shower. That's telling me that I'm done, but you haven't banged your spoons. So I'll just keep on rabbiting on then. Hey, dangerous move. All right. So I'll jump through. So around land, soil and biodiversity, now that he's given me a free go, I'll go back to all my piles of statistics. So 30% of the world's cropland has already been abandoned due to soil erosion and degradation, and that's over the last 40 years. We see issues... Oh, he's banging now. Oh, damn, I thought I was going to get away with that. All right. So, look, the major issues around land use in Victoria and in Australia we're seeing a lot of. They're around loss to urban development, particularly around peri-urban Melbourne, which is highly, highly productive agricultural land. Similarly, around a lot of our regional centres, Bendigo, Ballarat, Shepparton, etc., we're losing good quality land. In other parts of Australia, the battle is between prime farmland and mining land, and how that short-term kind of issue can be balanced with the long-term requirement for food production land. Key issues that I'll make sure I get into question time somehow around oil, and how we sort of seem to be sleepwalking into major issues with oil and how critical that is to food production. I think the costs for an Australian cropping production, about 32% of their profit goes back into fuel costs. So that's a huge contribution, and that's just the on-farm machinery. And then there's the production of fertilisers, all of that feeding into those systems as well. I'll stop there and I'll find ways to say everything else I want to say in the questions.